Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. My guest today is Dr. Tammy Nemeth. She is an historian and host of the Nemeth Report podcast. As Alberta oil and gas continues to be demonized by both foreign actors and our own federal government, it's important to hear other perspectives. So welcome to our program.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I guess my first question, pretty basic question, what is the state of the oil and gas sector in Alberta? And, there might be some opportunities as well as challenges. So why don't you give us your perspective on that?
Well, I think going forward, since the Allan Inquiry came out, the industry has to face the new Liberal government. And with Steven Guilbeault now as the minister responsible for environment, there are significant challenges facing the industry. What exactly is net zero? How do we go about situating the industry in order to participate in this new program that they want to put forward? And how can they contribute to this conversation? Because the government is actually proposing quite fundamental changes to our society with the net zero transition they're talking about. And there hasn't really been an open conversation about this.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And this is obviously, it preceded the COP26. I do want to talk about the COP26 conference in Glasgow in detail. But basically, you're saying that the appointment of the new Environment Minister, Guilbeault, is basically the signal that the Liberal government's not backing down on this. It's going to be decarbonizing the Canadian economy.
Absolutely. And I think one of the interesting developments this past week has been with the release of the different cabinet committees. And there's been 2 cabinet committees put forward that are doing the same thing. They have the same mandate, they have the same title, but they've split the cabinet. So there's Steven Guilbeault is on one of these cabinet committees, and Jonathan Wilkinson and Seamus O'Regan are on the other one. But they both have the same a sort of mandate to investigate how best to decarbonize Canadian society, with the mandate letter saying that by March, the Prime Minister wants some solid policy programs ready to go. And, it really hasn't been opened for a conversation with the Canadian public on what exactly does it mean to decarbonize your society? Mm-hmm. What will the impact have on the public in general, and what will this do to the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of this 2 cabinet committee thing, but I must tell you, as a former member of cabinet, that I've never heard of that before. Having 2 cabinet committees with the exact same name, but with different membership and supposedly similar mandates. So your guess is as good as mine as to what that means behind the curtain.
Exactly.
I want to get into the Allan Inquiry a little bit, maybe describe what that inquiry is and what the results were.
Well, the Allan Inquiry was set up pretty much as soon as Jason Kenney was elected Premier of Alberta. And the mandate was to investigate the foreign funding that had targeted the Alberta oil and gas industry. And they called it anti-Alberta energy. But it was met with lots of criticism from the environmental groups. It was taken to court. They would try to have it stopped and whatnot. And after the lengthy amount of time going through forensic accounting, they hired Deloitte to do this. They found proof and evidence that confirmed what Vivian Krause had been saying all along, that there was a significant amount of foreign funding that came into Canada deliberately, specifically to target the Alberta oil and gas industry, to basically landlock it, which would then, of course, mean it would be shut in the ground, right? Kept in the ground.
Mm-hmm. Where were these foreign funds coming from?
So predominantly from the United States. There were a few European foundations, particularly the Oak Foundation, that has funded quite a few of the environmental groups and certain aspects of what they were trying to do to shut down Canadian. It's now kind of gone more towards Canadian. The Oak Foundation is funding some things to do with the Arctic right now. but it's predominantly American money. And I think one of the sad parts is that the inquiry put together all of this amazing information, confirmed what Vivian Krause had been saying all the time, and no one really is talking about it because the findings are actually quite significant.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here with Dr. Tammy Nemeth. She is an historian and host of the Nemeth Report podcast. Tammy, we're just delving a little bit into this Allan Inquiry. You made it clear it was an investigation into some of the foreign funds and other funding against the Alberta oil industry. Were there any recommendations on how to deal with it, or was it just a fact-finding report, or what's its status right now?
Well, there were 6 recommendations at the end, and I believe that the first one is the most important, and that is that there needs to be more transparency and accountability from the Canadian sort of charitable industry on where they get their money from and how exactly is it being spent. Now, I know some of the criticisms of the inquiry findings were that, well, it didn't find any wrongdoing, but that's a super red herring because that wasn't in the mandate. It wasn't meant to look at wrongdoing. And the Harper government had tried to bring some more accountability and transparency to the charitable industry, and a lot of those changes were repealed by the Trudeau government. In fact, the Deloitte report that accompanied the inquiry report talked about these changes to the charitable legislation. And one of the redefinitions or enhanced definitions of what it means to be a charitable industry in Canada, where it allowed for public advocacy. And they consulted the environmental groups on how to change the regulations to be more amenable to the sorts of things perhaps that they wish to bring forward into our society, particularly with respect to energy and the environment.
So it requires the federal government to have a different tack then, is that right? There's nothing the Alberta government can do per se?
It's very difficult, I think, for the Alberta government to address some of these issues, particularly if groups are federal and they get organized or granted status from the federal government, and it affects their tax status federally. But I'm not sure what exactly the provincial government do, except perhaps take a stronger line on how they do review processes and whatnot in the province.
Right. Okay. Understood. Let's talk a little bit more about the COP26 in Glasgow earlier this year. I guess it was one of the top stories of 2021. And tell us your point of view about the conference, what was decided there, and what it means for Canada.
I think one of the most important developments that hasn't really been discussed very much with respect to COP26 is the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, the GFANZ, because that is looking at changing how financial institutions fund things. So they don't want the financial institutions to be able to provide funding to hydrocarbon companies, at least in the West, right? So if there's financing out there for private companies, it'll be much more difficult. They'll have to meet all sorts of ESG requirements, various decarbonization goals, and it can have a profound restructuring of the industry. And I think we'll see a lot more state-owned companies buying into different developments, particularly in the Middle East and Africa and Asia. I'm not sure how this will affect Canada to the extent maybe that more Chinese money will come in and invest here. But if we can't get the oil and gas out, what's the point of investment?
Yeah, so this is a change of corporate culture, obviously, and a lot of the investment funds that are owned by, let's say, pension funds, for instance, are finding ways to establish ESG goals and not invest in what they see as carbon industries. So this is a trend. It kind of preceded COP26, but you're saying it really came to the fore at that meeting. Is that right?
Right, because the group led by Mark Carney, which is the GFANZ group, they're looking to create a taxonomy that will be applied globally. And they're not really consulting with the industry on how this taxonomy ought to go. Because if you have the divestment movement, they're saying we can't invest in these things because they produce all of these carbon emissions. But if you can employ carbon capture technology, or you have different types of carbon tech that allows you to keep producing hydrocarbons with fewer or zero emissions, then why would you want to do divestment? Because you're meeting the ESG goals. So what's the point of having ESG goals if you're going to be promoting also divestment? It seems a bit contradictory.
We'll have to continue to follow that. And we're going to take another short break, Tammy. We'll be back after that break with a continuing conversation. So audience, please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom Bust. My guest today is Dr. Tammy Nemeth. She is an historian and host of the Nemeth Report podcast. Just final question on COP26, Tammy. Obviously, the Government of Canada's position dovetailed into what we were talking about in terms of ESG goals and, carbon neutral or carbon negative even. So what does that portend? You mentioned Minister Guilbeault and his plans and these cabinet committees coming to a crescendo maybe in the spring. Is that when the boom is going to be lowered on the oil and gas sector in Alberta and Canada?
I think so. I think if the boom isn't going to be lowered, at least it'll be introduced into Parliament, and maybe there'll be some discussion in Parliament. I know that the Net Zero Advisory Board has been accepting public comment for the past month. I think the deadline was today for people to comment on what they think the net zero ought to be. But it's, and they also had a just transition consultation earlier that was overwhelmed, I guess. But there's all these talks, and the people who are being consulted tend to be of a certain viewpoint that the hydrocarbons ought to be left in the ground. So I think the oil and gas industry, I hope that they're preparing for what could be coming in March, which is a significant alteration to how they do business and whether or not they can even continue to exist operating in Canada.
Yeah, and you've written, I know, about how net zero could be net painful, not only for these industry members, but for Canadians generally. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, a lot of the experts that the government has been consulting, particularly the Net Zero Advisory Panel, are in academia, and they produce many reports talking about how we have to be a more self-sufficient or have a sufficiency lifestyle. And there's talk of having carbon allowances. Now that people are used to having vaccine passports, it wouldn't be so much of a stretch to have people carry around how many emissions their lifestyle is contributing to climate change, and therefore have carbon allowances that basically manage and control our lifestyle. Mark Carney came along and said that what gets measured gets managed, and the plan is to sort of measure everything we do. And if you measure everything we do, then you can manage what we do. And I'm a little concerned about this idea of carbon allowances or personal carbon trading. It's an idea that came up in the UK about 12 years ago. The person who introduced it, her name is Tina Fawcett. She's from Oxford University. She had another paper just this year saying the time has come for this idea. Polly Toynbee in The Guardian put forward this idea about a month ago, once again, just during COP26, that maybe this is something we ought to be doing, where individuals need to be responsible for their emissions. The financial changes would also have an effect on this, because Mark Carney's talking about variable interest rates depending on what your carbon footprint is, not just for companies, but for everybody. So if you have personal carbon trading or you have carbon allowances, then all of that would be affected by what kind of mortgage you can get. Can you get a car loan? If you're not buying an electric car, you'll have a significantly higher interest rate. They were toying with different ideas on how to implement this. So the net zero life quite often ends up in fuel poverty, energy poverty, and now they want it to be, managing everything that you do and accounting for it.
And I think you're raising a very good point here. And of course, using the term poverty is very apropos as well, because this kind of thing is going to affect people who are on the line of making ends meet as it is. It will not necessarily affect the elites or the affluent. Mark Carney isn't going to have a problem paying for his net zero passport. So is this part of the problem?
Absolutely. I mean, I lived in Germany for 6 years, and even then, with their energy transition, we knew people who had to make a decision on whether they put food on the table or whether they heated their home. We'd go to visit people, and they would only be heating the room in which we were in. The rest of the rooms in the house were closed off and not heated because they couldn't afford it. I know that some people, their energy bills cost more than their mortgage. So there's an energy crisis going on in Europe right now. And I think we have to be mindful of what this portends for Canada. If we go down the same route as Germany or even the UK, that's really been investing in wind to the detriment of, shutting down coal plants and not building anything to replace them.
We're going to continue this conversation, Tammy. We've got one more segment. We're going to go to a little bit of a break, but please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Dr. Tammy Nemeth, historian and host of the Nemeth Report podcast. I was going to ask about nuclear energy, and I'm still going to ask about that, but I'm just continuing to think about your last responses and what this would entail for people. And you make a good point, and I'm not a conspiracist, and I believe us in a single shooter for Lee who killed Kennedy and all of that. But the vaccine passport idea, I could just see Justin Trudeau saying, well, that was a health emergency, so we needed the vaccine passports. Now we have a climate emergency, and we need this kind of basically a system to control human behavior in Canada. Is that one of your worries then?
Absolutely. I mean, right now there's an economist from the UK named Mariana Mazzucato, and she wrote an article last year in Project Syndicate advocating for climate lockdowns, that if people don't voluntarily change their lifestyle to be more environmentally friendly, then they'll have to bring in some kind of climate lockdown. She makes this warning very clear. She is now advising the British Columbia government on their economic recovery. So I don't think it would be much of a stretch to see that these ideas somehow work their way into not just provincial thinking, which could very well be, maybe they'll start it in a province, but to then be rolled out on a federal scale, particularly if they're pushing the net zero lifestyle changes, because it's not with net zero, it's not just industry that's affected.
No.
It'll be everybody. And I think that was a subject that didn't get discussed during the election. Justin Trudeau said that this election was going to be transformative, that it was the most important election ever in the history of Canada. And everyone thought, well, that's just rhetorical hyperbole.
Mm-hmm.
But if you understand what the net zero transition actually means, what decarbonation will mean for the average person, it will be catastrophic. And I can't, it's so hard to understand why people aren't more concerned and talking about this issue.
Well, that's why you're on my program, Tammy, so we can talk about this a little bit more. I do want to talk about nuclear energy because clearly, in terms of the ability to produce power that does not increase carbon emissions, the big elephant in the room is nuclear. But somehow environmentalists have become anti-nuclear. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I really like Michael Schellenberger's take on this issue, because everyone knows how he's still a very committed environmentalist. And he thought, why are they taking such a hard line against nuclear? And this is one of the ways that we ought to go. It's not as good as hydrocarbons for bringing in backup energy and so on, but as base energy, it would be amazing. What I find so problematic is that we have Saskatchewan and Alberta and Ontario and New Brunswick who have this arrangement to research more about small modular reactors. And the timeline on that seems to be forever. It'll be 10 or 12 years before anything's really happening.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Japan has a small modular reactor that got permission to go full production in July. It's operating. Why aren't we repurposing the technology the Japanese have already proven? Why aren't we building that here? Why do we have to reinvent the wheel and do some made in Canada thing when the Japanese have already invested and tested and are running it? And if this is the way that we want to go forward, why don't we partner with Japan? Aren't they our friends?
Yeah, I know exactly. And Japan, of course, that had the Fukushima incident after the tsunami, and said we're not doing nuclear anymore. Here they are doing some nuclear. So clearly, they can deal with the safety and security concerns. And as you mentioned, Michael Schellenberger has put a lot of those safety concerns in proper context because they get blown out of proportion by the environmentalist alarmists. So we'll see what happens on that front. I'm afraid that that will be it for now. Tammy, you're always welcome back on this program, and good luck with your work. And please see the Nemeth Report podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. I want to thank Tammy Nemeth, Dr. Tammy Nemeth, for joining our program, and really a very interesting message that she has about where we could be going with net zero after the COP26 summit, and what it might mean for you and the choices you're allowed to make in your life, not just that you want to make, but that you're allowed to make. We'll be following this story very closely. Thanks for watching.